Welcome everyone. We're just going to get started, so we've got a bit to get through tonight. Thank you for joining us for the Australian Digital Alliance Forum 2023 satellite event with Dr Ginny Barbour and Professor Tom Cochrane. So I'm Sarah Powell, the Executive Officer of the Australian Digital Alliance, the ADA, and also joining us tonight is Elliot Bledsoe, who is our Copyright Officer. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people as the first people and traditional owners of this land that I'm joining from in Canberra. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their communities and their cultures throughout Australia. So I just invite those of you attending today's session to acknowledge in the chat the custodians in the lands where you're joining us from, if you'd like to do so. And for those that may not be familiar with our organisation, the Australian Digital Alliance is the peak body in Australia promoting copyright law in the public interest. We are holding the annual ADA Copyright Forum, A Fair Future for Copyright, next week on Friday, 17th of February. So just check out our program online for more information. We have a great lineup with speakers, and we also have online and in-person tickets available if you would like to join us. So tonight's session will explore recent developments in open access across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. We will hear from Ginny first with some updates on important policy developments that support equitable and open access to research across Australasia. And then Tom will provide an update on a recent project on open access and university research. So just to introduce our speakers, we have Professor Ginny for short, Barbour, who is the Editor-in-Chief of the Medical Journal of Australia and Director of Open Access Australasia. She is an Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology, previously co-lead of the Office for Scholarly Communication at QUT. She trained in the UK in medicine at Cambridge University and University College and Middlesex Hospital Medical Schools, specialising in haematology. And she went on to do a Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford University and postdoctoral research in the US on globin gene regulation. She joined The Lancet in 1999, leaving in 2004 to be one of the 3 founding editors of PLOS Medicine. And in 2015, she joined the Open Access Australasia, previously known as the Australian Open Access Strategy Group, and has led its growth from 9 university members to 22 university members and 6 affiliate organisations, of which the ADA is one. She has been involved in many international open access, innovative scholarly communication, publication, and research integrity initiatives, including the final drafting of the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation in 2021. She was previously chair of the Committee on Public Ethics. She is currently vice chair of the Declaration on Research Assessment Steering Committee, a Plan S ambassador, a member of Confederation of Open Access Repositories, Executive Board, and a member of the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council's Research Quality Steering Committee. She was also an editorial advisor to medRxiv in the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Ginny, thank you so much for coming. That is a very incredible biography there. Good, done a lot. And joining Ginny is Emeritus Professor Tom Cochrane, who is currently Adjunct Professor in the Faculty of Law at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. He was formerly, until his retirement in December 2013, Deputy Vice-Chancellor at QUT. And in his current role, Professor Cochrane's external duties include Director of the Australian Digital Alliance, Deputy Chair, Library Board of Queensland, and member of the Copyright Reference Group for Universities Australia. He has also been co-leader of the Creative Commons project, for which QUT is the institutional partner for in Australia. And this project, together with other open access initiatives locally based at QUT, signals a long commitment to improving access to research outputs and supporting infrastructure worldwide. This is part of a wider general commitment to promoting access to knowledge and a fair go for every person in the copyright ecosystem. So welcome, Ginny and Tom. Thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I will share my screen, hopefully. Okay, I hope that's all working okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really delighted to help support this initiative, which is, as Sarah said, the ADA is one of the members of Open Access Australasia. I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm in Brisbane, Yanjin, which is the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. This is land that was never, sovereignty was never ceded here. And I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today, and to their elders past and present, and to note that we have work to do in ensuring that we properly include the work of Indigenous researchers in the work that we're trying to do today around open access. So I'm going to kick off by giving you some sort of update on some things that have been happening recently, and maybe some reflections for some challenges that lie ahead. So just a quick thing about Open Access Australasia. We're actually a bigger organisation. We've been growing year on year. We actually had a new member that started today. Bond University is our latest university member to join us. We also include a diverse group of organisations from across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, that include the Australian Digital Alliance, but also a really diverse group, including, for example, the Australian Citizen Science Association. And that's been really important for us as we've been advocating for a range of initiatives in open access. We have a set of principles that I would just highlight in particular, one of which is that we're very keen to see approaches to open scholarship that promote equity and scholarly communication. And we have done a lot of work around advocating for diverse approaches to open access and open science. And what do we do? Well, we do it through advocacy and collaboration globally and nationally. We raise awareness through a range of different routes, through working on social media and writing in various media. And we also do a fair bit of work on capacity building amongst our institutional members. And the latest thing that we did last year was we developed a course on Open Access 101. We've already had more than 250 people go through that, and we'll be repeating that this year. So we're trying very hard to support the open access ecosystem throughout its through all the different areas. So I think it's fair to say that we're living in very interesting and rapidly evolving times, in many different ways, but certainly in the open landscape. I think just before I go into what I'm going to talk about generally, I want to go back to a point that was reinforced really nicely yesterday in the talk on the open GLAM, which is that open access is much more than free access, and it's really important when we're talking about open to be quite specific about some of the definitions. So open access is, of course, immediate free access, but it also includes retention of copyright by the author. I'm talking here in particular around open access when we're talking to research outputs. It includes reuse rights that are specified through specific licenses. It includes attribution for the authors, and critically, it also involves secure linking and secure archiving. And without all of these being in place, it's fair to say that open access is not fully implemented. And I'd like you to hold that in as we go through and talk about some of the initiatives. So we know that we've been talking about open access for quite some time, not just in Australia and New Zealand, but also globally. But a couple of years ago, we put together a couple of slides that really looked at what had been happening in our two countries. And these are slides that this particular one was developed for the OA 2020 conference that was held a couple of years ago. And the point that I just want to make here is twofold. First off is, if you look right back in 2000, when ANU had its first open access repository. That was the very beginning, I would say, of a sort of serious conversation around open access. But in 2003, QUT, with Tom's leadership, had the world's first open access policy for its research outputs. And since that time, what we have seen is an absolute diversity of approaches. And critically, they're coming from across the ecosystem. So if you look in the top left, you can see that it includes work by peak advocacy bodies, such as Open Access Australasia and the Council of Australian University Librarians, but governments, funders, institutions, and there have also been some really key events. And if you look at Aotearoa, New Zealand, that you see a similar arc. Right back in the early 2000s with the development of open source library systems. And then, for example, in 2016, some really key initiatives such as the AUT, the Tufera Open Publishing Platform launch, which has been a really important driver, I think, of a sort of innovative small publishing operation that has been very influential. So what we've seen really across these two countries is a diversity of open access approaches. We need to update this because this only goes to the end of 2021, and in 2022 there were some pretty substantial initiatives. But we do, of course, know that COVID was a massive disruptor to open access. I think it's fair to say that we understood at that point that we were going to need access to all the research. From the obvious, you know, we thought at the very beginning it was simply a respiratory disease, so we wanted to know about old and new coronaviruses. We wanted to know about how to build ventilator parts, how to build face masks, and of course disinfectants was a big topic at the beginning. But then we also understood that there were lots of different areas of research that we were going to need information on. So the things that, you know, how do things spread on cruise ships? You'll remember right at the very beginning that was a big source of infection. How do we develop things such as delivering pharmacies resources when we can't get out of our cars, when we can't actually, you know, go into physical buildings? And how do we support diverse groups of individuals at different stages? So I think what we found in the pandemic was a really clear illustration of the need that we needed access to all research. And, you know, if we talk about the need for open access being, you know, the principles that I talked about earlier, it also became really clear that of the importance of human and machine readable formats being critical in properly delivering open access, and also linkage to other key resources. So, for example, Scholar, which links papers to data, and Crossref, which links to references. So the need for an open access ecosystem became really clear. And it's fair to say that it's changed publishing really profoundly. This is a paper that was taken, I'll put the resources on here and I'll share my slides, but just to say right at the very beginning, and you can see here that at the 1st of April, this is when the cases began to take off. And in the top here, you have the purple, which is journal articles, the green, which is preprints. And in the bottom graph, what you see is a huge diversity of preprint servers that kind of became really important venues for publications. So yes, journal articles were important, but preprints took on a level of importance that we really hadn't considered before. And some of these were very new. So medRxiv was really just a few months old at the beginning of the pandemic. And really very early on, it was clear it was going to publish a huge amount of research related to COVID-19. What that led to was also a huge databases of open research. So the CORD-19 database, which was a really important one, that was developed as a result of a call for participation from the US, but also a number of science agencies globally, grew in the end to more than 1 million indexed articles. More than 300,000 of those were freely available online, and the database itself has been downloaded as in its entirety hundreds of thousands of times. What we do know is that not all that research was immediately open, but it became an incredibly important source for artificial intelligence to scrape and analyze the COVID-19 resources. And this comes back to the point of the importance of machine readable research at all stages of the pandemic, but also beyond. What we also saw was a huge increase in readership of the academic literature. So this again is from the very early stages of the pandemic, but medRxiv in the first few months went from having a relatively small amount of readership to more than 10 million abstract views in April alone, and more than 5 million downloads in April. So these were not just academics reading these papers. They were being read by individuals globally. So it really changed the whole way we thought about access to research. And incidentally, there was a whole interesting thing that we're finding about the citation usage of papers during the pandemic that I won't spend much time on here, but if anyone's interested in following up, I'd be more than happy to. So just bearing that in mind, what's happening in policy now? So just starting with Australia, I think it's fair to say that it's going in one direction in both Australia and in New Zealand. So Dr. Cathy Foley, who became Australia's chief scientist in 2021, named open access one of the key pillars of her strategic work plan, and she is working on that right now. The National Health and Medical Research Council, which consulted on an open access policy in 2021, in 2022 implemented that policy, requiring immediate open access to the research that it funded, and it joined Plan S, which I'll come on to in a moment. And, with regard to negotiations with publishers, CAUL has led the work around negotiating read and publish agreements, which allow academics to publish in journals without immediate author-facing article processing charges. And these were really important, but there are some challenges associated with these. These are complex agreements. They're often not really transparent, and it's not clear that they're going to lead to true transformation in the scholarly publishing market, but they are an important route for academics right now to make their research openly available. And the same is true in New Zealand. So in July 2022, an intern in the Chief Science Advisor's office developed a fantastic report which looked about the future of open access in New Zealand. And that has led to a really renewed conversation around the importance of open access there. And in October 2022, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MBIE, came up with its own open research policy. And that is just the first step in what I think is likely to be a rapid change in the open research environment in New Zealand in the next few years. And internationally, we've seen an enormous amount of things happening. And again, I'll go through these relatively quickly. But the first thing to note is that there is an initiative called Plan S that I'm sure many of you will have heard of, which is supported by an organisation called Coalition S, which is an international consortium of research funding and research performing organisations. And in this region, the NHMRC is now a member of Coalition S. And they stated very early on that what they wanted to have was immediate open access to the research that they funded, so with a Creative Commons license and no embargo. And that will be in place from the beginning of 2021. And since that time, they've done increasingly innovative pieces of work, for example, in looking at the ecosystem of what are known as diamond, no-fee paying open access journals. And they've also done a large amount of work on repository-based open access. So they are supporting open access through a variety of routes, and it has led to quite substantial changes in the policy environment globally. In the open science area, so the most important initiative that I'd talk about is the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, and this was adopted in 2021. What it really talked about is the importance of open access, not just to research, but also a number of other open parts of the research ecosystem. So open dialogue with other knowledge systems, so that, for example, includes with citizen science, open engagement with societal actors. In our area, that includes, for example, open acknowledgement of the importance of Indigenous knowledges, open science infrastructures, both virtual and physical, and of course open access to research, but also research data as well as research publications. And it came up with a definition of open science, which is the first internationally agreed definition, and has been really important again in changing how we're thinking about open research more generally. These are the objectives. I won't read them all out, but I think it's a relatively short document. I'd really encourage you to look at it if you're interested, because it lays out also the need not just to talk about what open science is, but how we actually get there. And one of the key objectives of the initial recommendation, which is not legally binding, but there is an expectation that all UNESCO countries that signed up to it, and it was universally adopted, will actually work towards it, was the very first one was promoting a common understanding of open science. And there's very active work going on right now among a number of UNESCO open research working groups that are trying to take this forward, the most important of which I think will be how the research is monitored. And when they talk about the open science, again, it's not done in isolation, but it's underpinned by values and principles. And these are kind of built into the work that UNESCO is doing in the implementation of the policy. And I think it has really led to a change globally in how we think about how open research can and should be done. Another initiative that I just highlight is that led by the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, so CORE, that's the group that I'm on the executive committee on, talks about the need for a diversity of approaches. We know that we can get open access to publications through large publishers, but also there is an absolute need to think about the wider ecosystem. And that includes, for example, repositories, but also, the new things that we're seeing arising, such as preprint servers. And the importance of those in particular is that they reflect the needs of local and individual and national priorities. So, for example, we know that much of research is published in English, and what that means, unfortunately, is that research published in local languages may be lost within this open research ecosystem. So this concept of bibliodiversity, the idea of needing a diversity of approaches, is something that CORE feels is really important, not just to see a more open world, but also to have a more diverse and equitable one. And, rather very importantly, the US White House has now weighed in very substantially on the importance of open access. Back in August 2022, it came up with what it called guidance to its federal agencies to make their research immediately open without delay. I mean, they say it's guidance, but, the US White House is the head of the executive in the US, so I think it's pretty clear that when they issue guidance, the federal agencies will follow. And interestingly, in January, whilst I think most of us was probably still on holiday, they also announced the Year of Open Science in the US, and they've come up with a number of policies associated with that. So I think that we're going to see a lot of action on open access and open science in 2023 from the US. So what's the future? I think just one thing I would really highlight is the importance of what do we look at, what really needs to be open. And there's a piece of work that is being done led by Creative Commons and EIFL and SPARC. So EIFL is an international library organization, and SPARC is the consortial group in the US, which has advocated for open access for a long time, and Creative Commons. And they have developed what they're calling the Open Climate Campaign, and they are advocating very substantially for the importance of open access to climate research. This was a focus of Open Access Week last year, and it's been picked up in a number of different places. And I've just put up here also journals are now making a commitment to that. Medical Journal of Australia has, but a number of medical journals globally have done the same. So I think that we have the challenge of balancing innovation and these principles into this open ecosystem. And I think the unfortunate thing that we are going to see is that it's going to be a complex ecosystem. Previously, we had quite a complex closed ecosystem, but now we're moving to a more complex open ecosystem. And I think to some extent we have to sort of embrace that and understand there are multiple routes to openness. So I'll just finish with a few thoughts. The first thing I think to say is that we need to be aware of some of the real challenges that are happening right now. So we know that consolidation in publishing is a real problem. This was a paper that was published a few years ago that looked at the consolidation in publishing from the top 4 or 5 publishers, and it depends slightly which discipline you're in, which ones are involved here. But there's some really terrifying things here, because you can see that towards the right-hand side of the graph, in some areas, more than 70% of the literature is owned by a real handful of publishers. And what that means is that they can dictate the world that they want to see, and it becomes hard to advocate effectively outside of that. We know that some of the publishers are active in even promoting further consolidation. So Springer Nature has in particular been very keen on this, and they are trying to persuade institutions that they should move away from repositories, for example. And I think we need to be very aware of the challenges and advocate actively for this concept of bibliodiversity that I mentioned earlier. And it's not just consolidation that we're seeing in publications, we're also seeing it in infrastructure. And the Invest in Open initiative is doing a large amount of work looking at the challenges around this, and they highlighted one back earlier last year. For example, in the PID world, which is the persistent identifiers, we're also seeing consolidation of the companies around that. And what that will mean is that we then again lead to a small number of organisations driving the agenda. And a really interesting area that I don't really have time to talk about is one of the challenges that we're beginning to see now is people are beginning to understand what's happening to the data that is being collected by this small number of publishers that dominate our world. And in the US, we know, for example, some of that data gets sold on in areas that I think we might find quite surprising if we, delved into it. And this is Sarah Landman has written a book that has just recently kicked off the debate on this again, and I think it's a really important area for us to be aware of. So I just think that we should really be thinking about a diverse ecosystem. I would really love us to see open approaches to sciences, because I do worry that if we don't come up with approaches that are kind of driven by the community and by countries, we're going to end up with an ecosystem that is driven primarily by commercial opportunities that will not necessarily lead us to the kind of open world that we want. So I will stop there and look forward to questions afterwards.
Right. Well, thank you, Ginny. I too will join you and Elliot in acknowledging the Turrbal and Jagera people as custodians of the land here in Meanjin, where some of us are this evening. I'll just share my screen here. Hope that that's visible to folk. Okay. The picture of diversity and activity that Ginny's just painted shows us how much is happening. But there's another observation, which is that the idea of open access and the practice of open access is actually more than 30 years old now, if you count back to the days when the physicists first started doing it. So the starting point for the research project that I'm about to describe is to try and seek an answer to the question of why it has been so terribly slow. So the title of the research that the group has been doing is Negotiating the Production, Management and Ownership of Knowledge in the 21st Century University. And it comes from an observation, which is that there's a fundamental tension at the heart of the research system, which is the tension between a copyright system that's predicated on limiting access and a research impact agenda that really depends on getting out there, broader societal engagement with the research that's happening in our research institutions. So the project seeks to understand this tension and to suggest some ways of having increased coherence in copyright and research policy. And it's funded by the ARC. Its duration is actually from 20 to 22, but we're still in it, partly because of delays that were brought about by COVID's effect on us. The research team are from law faculties, so they're there listed on the screen. And one of the starting points in terms of discipline and knowledge and expertise that's particularly interesting about this is that they're copyright and intellectual property academics. So they're folk who come from a deep understanding of copyright law, engaging in thinking about how open access might be better supported and sustained from the point of view of university policy, starting from that observation that it's been happening much more slowly than one would expect. And in the sense that this is an ADA forum and that ADA is a copyright law reform advocacy group, that's quite an interesting blend, the background of the academics in this and the topic that they're dealing with. When you think about what a university is, its core function is producing and disseminating knowledge, and it does that through a couple of ways. One is research outputs, which have been peer reviewed and quality certified, but also graduates who go into the professions and into the workplace and take with them and build on expertise that they've originally started acquiring in universities. The laws, policies and practices that govern behaviour in universities is very complicated. university and industry goals don't necessarily align. And one of the issues that we encounter in this work is understanding that there are different pressures on researchers at different stages of their careers. Our approach, policy analysis. So looking at policies across the sector and knowing at the outset really that one of the places that we might land on would be suggestion of much greater harmonisation of those in the Australian sector. We did some field work, which I'll come to in a moment. We've had interaction with funding councils and conversations with relevant parallel developments. Ginny referred to the work of the chief scientist in trying to consider and propose a national approach to open access. So, of course, that was very, very relevant to us. And we've come to some preliminary conclusions, which I'll come to towards the end. Just a note that this investigation and the framing of our own outputs is from a perspective which is informed by that legal and IP expertise that I referred to just before. A significant part of the project also concerns First Nations intellectual property and research outputs and the way that should be treated. And there are some differences there which part of the project is concerned with, but I'm not reporting on that this evening. So the university policies that we looked at, which impact on this question of research management and dissemination and so on. All universities have IP policies. They are not the same. They also have research commercialisation policies, policies on data management, on authorship, commercial in confidence, which can also intersect heavily with research commercialisation, of course. A lot of universities have specific open access policies, and of course, they're not all the same either, as well as others on scholarly publishing and research governance and rules and procedures that govern the way that institution will collaborate with partners, both in other academic institutions and in industry, as well as different funding policies. When we looked at policies, we're very aware of the fact that a lot of researchers and academics, they kind of get the main issue, they get the main principle. But if individual academics are looking for guidance from the policy environment that they're in, it can often be a bit confusing. So here's an example from an anonymous sample university where there's a statement, for example, that copyright's a unique form of IP and is dealt with under a separate university policy. But when the member of the research team actually clicked on that link, I'm talking to the box that's on the right-hand side of this slide, they actually found that it referred to a hyperlink, which referred to a statement about copyright over website content, not actually the copyright policy. And another one from another university, I mean, here's a pretty clear statement that the university assigns the right to publish scholarly works to the creator of the work, but that's after asserting its own ownership of all IP created by staff in the course of their employment. But that assignment is then subject to licenses. And then, of course, the other thing that comes across the top of that is when a publisher agreement is about to be signed, it can have content that inherently contradicts some or all of the IP and open access policy. And quite frankly, a lot of researchers, when they're confronted with this complexity, don't go into it too much. They simply want to sign. One of the things we found in our field work was that one of our standard questions was, do you read publisher agreements when you're about to sign? And the answer in the vast majority of cases was no. The law is complicated. We have to concede that. And university policies are underpinned by different laws, not just the Copyright Act. And similarly, publishing agreements can be extremely long. And we've seen examples in recent times of great complexity in the so-called transformative agreements, the publisher agreements for read and publish as well. Another thing that comes up commonly is that contract law is not well understood. So the question in the end is, who has the onus to make sense of it? and where do researchers find help in their institutions. To get more of a picture of what's actually going on in Australia at the current time, we did this field work. I know this is a busy slide, but I'll go over the main points here. In 2020 and 21, and some in 22, we conducted interviews, 52 all told, with that number of participants that you can see there across universities that were from these different subgroups of universities. They were typically an hour and a half in length, and they covered things like awareness of the research policies and strategies of that institution, discussion with researchers in particular of the pressures that they're under, discussion with them about publishing behaviour and their understanding of open access, including their knowledge or otherwise of whether their own institution has an open access public policy. And quite a lot of time was spent on article processing charges. One of the things that I was personally quite surprised by, having been in this field for quite a while, was the very clear fact that if you mention the phrase open access to university researchers and administrators who've got research in their portfolio, they more or less regard it as meaning article processing charges. That's what they immediately think. And it immediately, therefore, goes into a set of considerations about funds, who's got the funds to support article processing charges. And what's actually happening in a lot of institutions is that where there's a decision to support publishing only in higher ranked journals, access to support for article processing charges is being made available on the basis of that prestige ranking, and that produces a further complication. And we also talked about folks' knowledge of copyright and their IP laws. You can see that the interviews have been pretty much equally distributed between STEM and that is science and technology and humanities and social sciences disciplines. And we also found that we were talking to a group of support staff and people with expertise in the area of supporting academic staff too, as well as researchers up to and including Deputy Vice-Chancellor's research. We're still analysing and writing up the full results of that field work. I would make one comment about it, which is most people understand perfectly well how distorted the costs of scholarly publishing, especially for the sector to buy back its own outputs, have become. They understand that there is a small group of extremely powerful and influential publishers who are dominating what happens in the field, but they're absolutely driven by their own workloads and job objectives and the tasks that are associated with research, including bringing on early career researchers and so on, and therefore not able to give the time to lead significant change at a policy level in their own institution. That was really evident. Now, when you think about what's going on, when you think about what's really driving behaviour in universities as institutions, on the left-hand side of this chart, you'll see that we're talking about research assessment exercises of various kinds, competition for research grants and research block grant funding, and constantly being driven by the desire to improve university rankings. So there's this kind of schizoid thing that happens in the sector, which is that people recognise that the rankings can be based on some pretty shaky data, but that doesn't stop individual institutions from really struggling to improve their position each year. Academics themselves, on the right-hand side, are concerned with getting the funding that really dominates the day-to-day life of successful or aspiring researchers. That in turn leads to personal benefit, of course, in the form of appointment and promotion, mobility in the sector, being attached to research groups that you want to be attached to, and so on. A lot of universities, pretty much universally now, have annual performance review processes where a research activity and outcomes are assessed. And those outcomes are very, very strongly about getting grants in the first place and then producing outputs in the scholarly publishing system at the end of that. And there's preoccupation, of course, among academic staff with workload allocation, pay, and whether the areas that they're working in are continuing to be supported, or whether there's a fear of redundancy in terms of the way that that research area is developing. We would characterize the Australian approach as messy. It's complex in all jurisdictions probably, but one of the things we've been living with in Australia is that the public, the funding councils that administer public funding for research brought in OA policies a while ago, but when we were doing our fieldwork discussions, it was frequently reported that people didn't check to see whether that aspect of the grant had been complied with. Of all the things that people are doing when they carry out a grant leading to publications, this one doesn't get a lot of space. So if there'd been a different and more rigorous approach in the beginning, as we've seen, particularly in some European and UK jurisdictions, that would probably look a bit different. Inconsistent policies, which of course we're aware of, and we will have some recommendations about what might happen there. One of the things that's gone backwards, and Ginny mentioned this, the support for institutional repositories has gone from a situation where over 10 years ago, the Commonwealth distributed funding to every institution in the country to set up institutional repositories to support research quality assessment exercises, to a point where now at least one or two respondents on the administrative side said back to us, oh, well, that's a thing of the past. Institutional repositories are not, that's not what we do now. And I think that has to really be rethought, particularly in terms of that diverse kind of landscape that Ginny's talking about, and for other reasons. We've seen Read and Publish develop. We don't think that that's international best practice from what we've seen, and publishers are controlling that process very strongly. One of the things that was very concerning to discover was that the terms of some of those agreements are not regarded as commercial in confidence as they're being negotiated, and that's particularly at the institutional level. That was quite concerning. So if anything, that kind of confusion that we were aware of at the beginning of doing this project is kind of confirmed by some of these developments. So if we look at an enabling legal framework that might come out of doing this work, a very important area, and of course this is familiar to people who've been working in library fields and familiar to folk doing various projects for CAUL, the Council of Australian University Librarians, is how important rights retention is. It is absolutely key that partial retention of copyright ownership needs to be maintained, and that is part of a strategy to try to put some kind of boundary around the notion of publishers having full copyright ownership. The other thing that we think we need is some, what we know we need are some further changes in copyright law. So given that Australia doesn't show any evidence of moving to a fair use regime, which has been the preferred position of the ADA for a long time, we do think that there are some specific things that need to occur in terms of right to quotation, text and data mining rights, avoiding situations where when there's an expiration of copyright, there's the capacity to re-copyright material, as it were. point D here is called the Hargreaves exceptions, named after Hargreaves in the UK, which essentially, at least for libraries, states that libraries and their users are able to enjoy copyright exceptions no matter what a license might claim. And that's quite similar to some work that was done, but more broadly in Australia, that I was involved with more than 20 years ago, which is the Contract versus Copyright Review, which doesn't specify that it's about libraries, but did suggest that the government might consider asserting that what Parliament legislates in relation to copyright cannot be overridden by private contract. Nothing's happened about that, of course. And then a secondary publication right, which might be pursued. So where we've got to in the last year or so is that there's two scenarios about achieving open access in the kind of comprehensive and universal way that we've been able to imagine for many years, but has never happened. One is that essentially the whole process is outsourced. And, you could see that if there was a really sustained extension of read and publish deals, so on, and that those got rolled over in a regular, understood way, no matter what the cost, that one of the attractions to that is that researchers, it's not something that they then have to worry about. It's convenient. But what it does, of course, is make our entire sector even more dependent in fulfilling OA requirements. And that's a concern, a really significant long-term strategic concern. The second scenario is that the sector takes some ownership. There's a phrase that's been around for a very long time, which is the idea that the publisher tail wags the research sector dog. And when you look at the scenarios that we have in trying to achieve this goal of more openness in sharing the results of quality scholarship, the inability of the sector to get that greater stipulation of ownership has been one of the biggest issues. So we see partial copyright ownership being essential, that the alternatives that provide leverage in particularly integrated repositories and the copyright exceptions that I just referred to. And we might continue to have a read and publish landscape for a while, but with more of an assurance, if you like, almost an insurance policy, that the sector is able to walk away and still pursue a higher level of open access. So that's again the team. This slide was actually based on a presentation by one of the colleagues in the team, Kim Wetherell, and there are a couple of other slides I can come to if those issues come up, but I'm happy to wrap up there and to go into the questions part of this evening.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you, Ginny. That was very interesting, and it was just really good to see so many developments in New Zealand and also Australia with open access. And Tom, the research that you're doing looks absolutely incredible, and I think it'll be very valuable for the sector. So there are a couple of questions that we have for you. I'll just find one from Katja Henry. I'm looking forward to reading more about this research, Tom. It resonates strongly with what we are experiencing at our institution with our researchers. It is a tall mountain to climb, but what are some simple things or quick wins that we can do to counteract the influence of publishers on the research landscape?
Yeah, well, thanks, Katja. Thanks, Sarah. Well, I'm thinking that if we could have a more harmonised approach to developing the legal framework that governs IP and related policies in our institutions, that would need to be done in a coordinated way. There would need to be some level of leadership and support through Universities Australia or ultimately through government. I've come to the conclusion a long time ago that real change also has to be driven by the government's approach to how it decides to assess research quality. If you have research assessment exercises that hold up published output, particularly this phrase version of record, as the only thing that matters, that reinforces the current way of doing things. So being aware of the rights retention, being aware that there are some aspects of Australian copyright law that need to be reformed that would help us. And I think there's a bottom-up, top-down requirement that would lead to real change. The top-down really needs to come from government. And it is not simply a marshalling of funds so that we can all pay more for an open access scenario by pooling all of the millions that we're paying now into a one kind of national agreement. That's not going to ultimately work. The other thing that I do think every institution should do is revisit what it is doing with its repositories. Institutional repositories, far from being a thing of the past, I think are a really key part of the landscape that Ginny was describing earlier to assure open access.
Thanks, Tom. I actually worked at AUT and I have a lot of colleagues at Tuwhera that Ginny talked about. So if you get a chance to go and have a look at that Tuwhera website, there's some great stuff on there. There's just a couple more questions. This is from Paula Cullen. How do we push back against publishers who use a lockstep manuscript submission system to discourage academics attempting to negotiate rights retention?
It's a really interesting question, Paula, because one of the things that's happened during the life of the project is that some of the research active staff on the project have been having unpleasant experiences with publishers in getting something published, in another field, including realizing that publishers are developing more and more sophisticated means of controlling manuscript submission, which clicks you into a surrender of rights. Okay, so it's not even as simple as looking through a document which no one used to anyway and then signing. It's something where you're being seduced into, trapped into this process, and actually think it's a timely reminder that that's something that we need to make some kind of recommendation about in our final work. The simplest advice about pushing back is you try to have some process to stop people from doing that in your institution. But the problem always is that people are seeking publication in a particular outlet that may be one of those.
One thing I'd just add is that, and I think this perhaps goes to Katja's thing about what we can do that's relatively easy. I don't think this is easy, but actually we do know that institutions, for example, that if they were to tie promotion to the availability of a version of record, a version in the repository, and you could incentivize academics to actually make that version available. We know that all this comes back to incentives. Is that right now the researchers have very little incentive to make their research open unless it's mandated, and it's very hard to do that. So I think that we could develop systems that actually incentivize it. But as Tom says, they need to come from the top. And a piece of work that we did with CALL is that if you're looking at international policies, it has to come from government, it has to come from the Prime Minister and Cabinet, or a similarly very highly kind of rated individual. If you're doing it at universities, if it doesn't come from the top and it's not baked into academic incentive structures, then very little will change. But I do think this idea of also, as Tom mentioned about, we talk about the version of record. CALL turns it on its head and talks about this concept of recording the version. So, this kind of digital literacy, I think, for academics would help a lot in helping them understand what their rights are here.
Thanks, Ginny. There is just one question that may feed into that from Debbie Smith. How can we encourage researchers to read their publishing agreements?
So
with extreme difficulty.
Well, I don't think they should have to. We need to build a system that requires them not to do it. I mean, I don't read the instructions on, I don't know, how my toilet works. I just expect it to work. I think there is a system. This is a system-wide thing, and I really expect that we should not be relying on individual academics who to have to do that. So I would love to say that we take that out of the system and build a system that works, really easily. Right now there is a challenge with repositories. I would say was that repositories actually can be quite hard to deposit into. Actually, and the level of understanding of academics for what's required is pretty low. I mean, I suspect everybody here knows what a DOI is. I've spoken to very senior academics who do not know what a DOI is. And when you say to them, it's really easy, just type in your DOI, put your DOI in, and then everything will be uploaded. They go, well, what's a DOI? So there's quite a bit of work to be done that's relatively simple, I think, in the education space.
Yeah. We just have one question from Bronwyn Coop. In any scenario, will libraries still have a role in archiving and assist with access to open access publications, or will repositories manage their resources into the future?
Oh, look, I'm not quite sure what that's getting at, but in most institutions, in fact, I think probably all institutions in Australia that I know of, institutional repositories and their management has been a library function or an extension of the library function. And if it's done well, it can get quite a lot of collaboration and input from the Office of Research as well, particularly if you've got a harmonized approach to lodging work in the repository that then becomes the basis of research reporting for various, all the reasons that things need to be counted and accounted for. So that, and the other thing is that in some institutions, support of scholarly publishing innovations also come from libraries, but it's always best to think of this as being something that straddles various organizational elements of the university. There's a quite interesting question about commercialization of repositories. Yes, I mean, can I make a general comment there? One of the things that's happened, and Ginny probably knows more about this in detail than I do, but one of the things that's been happening over a period is that in some disciplines, repositories have been developed as a basis for sharing the research in that set of disciplines. And when they start doing well, they get bought. And who buys them? One of the big publishers. So that's one thing that's happening. The second thing that's happening is that the amount of data that's in the hands of big publishers that relates to research and the things that universities define as important to them in measuring how good they are is growing all the time. And publishers have got a very clear business strategy, which is there is no way that they want this phenomenon of open access to disrupt their profitability. So they don't mind open access as long as the amount you're paying for it through article processing charges is a complete replacement, revenue replacement for what they used to get for subscriptions. And of course, the issue with that is that a starting point for a lot of people on open access, apart from the merits of the idea itself, was to try and do something to respond to the extraordinary rises in subscription prices that we've really seen over several decades. So I suppose the other thing that's at the back of this is the sector and the people who have responsibility in the sector for thinking about these things really need to have their eyes open about the long-term business strategy of the big publishers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With regard to the open repository, one thing I would say is that one organisation I mentioned, the Invest in Open, is doing a great piece of work at looking at, who owns key infrastructure and how can we move to a world where not just the outputs are open, but actually the infrastructure that supports it is. And they're also doing work on, what are the models that we need to do that. So think it's a really important question about how we ensure that we don't move to a closed system. And so, for example, you can have principles that organisations are set up under, so they can't be bought, or they can't be bought by commercial organisations. So I think that if you're interested in that space, the Invest in Open Infrastructure is doing really interesting work there.
Thanks, Ginny. Tom?
I've just seen another question that I wanted to respond to, which is from Stephanie.
If you see the questions and want to respond,
Okay.
that's really fine.
So Stephanie Barbour, which is how do we get, it's the last sentence of the question, really, or the last part of it, how do we get influence university executive to focus on the quality of research rather than journal rankings that then feed into university rankings? That's a really key point. And what's interesting is there's another paradox in the system. When someone peer reviews a scholarly output, they're commenting on the quality of the output. That has no direct relationship to the journal that it ultimately appears in. And a big way of diluting the influence of publishers would be to take journal titles as such out of the mix as prestige measures completely. No matter, even if it's nature, that the thing that's actually being measured in terms of quality is at the article level. There's even a line of argument that says it's a bit of an article, but let's just stay with the article, the output. And if we can get that recognised by getting journal titles taken out of any research assessment exercise, that would partly lead to that. But it goes back to this point. University executives, them just by themselves, are not going to do that. That has to be a system-led thing with leadership from government.
I've just noticed that we have just gone over 7 o'clock. If you are happy to continue talking, please stay. Ginny and Tom will be here for a few more minutes. If there's any other questions, Tom, that you'd like to answer, feel free to just keep talking.
Yes, I'm interested in the comment from Richard White, which is about going down different paths, green and gold. I think timeframes are important here. I'm pretty hopeful that we can rebuild impetus to strengthen the repository and therefore the green approach. But there's a lot of work needed. But it's really pleasing to think that New Zealand's going down that more rational path. An interesting observation in this is when the European Commission directed that open access be achieved through either gold or green methods back in 2013, 14, that sort of time. The member states, as they do, chose different routes. So I don't know how it looks now, but I remember there was a time when Belgium and Denmark, for example, were really keen on the green route, but the Netherlands and Austria and some other member states went gold. And of course, that then got superseded by some of the discussion later on about high-level negotiations to achieve through agreements with publishers, which kind of reinforced the momentum for gold.
Yeah, I think the point that I would make is that I think that we are going to see a diversity of approaches. And I know that we often think that, when we equate journal-based open access with big publishers, actually, there's this huge kind of global world of these no-fee diamond open access. In fact, the Coalition S call it an archipelago of journals that is incredibly important, that we know that publish in, local languages, that kind of publish research that nobody else would ever publish if it wasn't published in a local journal. So I don't think we should kind of throw out the idea of journal-based open access necessarily. I mean, I think we just need to think about what kind of journals we want to support. I think that's the bigger challenge for us at this point. And this comes back to this concept of having a diverse set of approaches that are all really well interlinked. And this is part of the work that Confederation of Open Access Repositories is looking at when they talk about next generation repositories. They don't see them as sitting in isolation. They see them as a linked part of the whole ecosystem. And I think we are still missing that kind of proper linkage yet.
Thanks, Ginny. Richard has just said that there's nearly 13,000 no APC OA journals listed in the DOAG. So
I just wanted to reflect actually on one of the things that Katja asked about, whether they're kind of easy wins for us to talk about. And one thing I do think we could do as a group of, you know, people who are kind of knowledgeable in this area is try and de-jargonify, if that's a phrase, some of this. I was on a call a couple of days ago when, you know, we talk about green open access, we talk about, you know, gold open access, there's bronze open access. And rather, the coalition has wrote in this rather lovely blog post that, you know, we could have pink polka dot open access. You know, who cares what it's called? Let's actually just really make sure we're talking about, we know what we're talking about. So I think one of the issues that we have with academics in particular is that when we say gold open access, they equate it with APC charging open access, whereas gold originally was just journal-based open access. So use specific terms, and that I think will help us educate authors to understand what they're actually you know, supporting.
Yeah.
And yes, I am supporting Richard. I am criticising your jargon.
I agree with that point. I'd like to mention another finding that we've had on the way through doing the fieldwork, which took some of us by surprise. But if anyone familiar with scientific journals wouldn't be so surprised, but we found that not only were researchers being asked to find quite steep article processing charges, they're also being charged if they wanted a more prominent position, for example, on the cover of that issue of the journal, even if it's mainly digital, and also if they wanted certain qualities of graphics that would illustrate their point, that there were extra charges for that. So there's not just one revenue stream that journals are extracting from the current environment, and that's of concern as well.
yeah, absolutely. Cool. Do you have any further comments or any further thoughts? Happy to wrap it up. Elliot's just put in the chat that the recordings of all 3 webinars will be available on the ADA copyright, or that Australian Digital Alliance YouTube channel, but it will be after the forum, so probably in a few weeks or so. But thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Ginny and Tom for sharing. Thank you, Tom, for sharing a project. Thank you, Ginny, for sharing those updates. That was really good. And thank you everyone for the discussion. And we'll see you later. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.